explore this in 3 main points. My first point that I'm going to try and demonstrate, which maybe I don't even need to demonstrate, everyone knows it, that Bible stories are never only stories of people long ago, but always stories about us, about the human condition, about humanity. And I think most of us discover ourselves in Bible stories. I just want to go through the main points that I want to make, and then I will take one at a time. The second main point I want to make today is that the stories shaped Israel's identity as a people, but the stories were also shaped by Israel's journey, identity, and faith experiences. And I will try and explain what I mean by that. And the third point I want to make is that miracles are surprising events that renew faith. And that can happen to anyone, even today. It's not as miracles happened in biblical times and they don't happen anymore. So I'll start with the first point. Bible stories are never only stories of people long ago. They're always stories about us and about humanity. I don't know how it is with you, but I've really always in my life found myself in Bible stories, sometimes in the one, sometimes in the other. And this year there were quite a few stories and texts that gained a completely new relevance for me personally. It is important to look at the Bible as history, and that's why we study theology. We try to discover what probably did happen there and what situation is it from. But ultimately, the Bible is not about ancient history, but about faith. One needs to read it as a witness to faith. And people repeated these stories as their own story, retold it and retold it again long before anyone wrote them down. And I think the Bible still functions like that for countless people. I learned this lesson quite early in my life. We had a family devotional, which my father, who was an Old Testament scholar, liked very much because it brought in some of this background and maybe critical reading of the Bible. We read it at least 6 or 7 years in a row. And it profoundly shaped my understanding of Bible texts. I remember the story of Adam and Eve, which carried the title, Mr. Everyman and Mrs. Life. That simple little detail showed that this was not a story about 2 individuals long ago, but a story about the human condition. And I think similarly, the story of the wandering through the wilderness is a story of the human condition, something we all experience again and again in our life, and how we need to learn to trust God in difficult times of trial. I was surprised this year how many sermon texts stood out for me in a new way, made sense, became messages for us in our situation. The wilderness story became particularly one that stood out for me this year, and it was through the children's ministry that I was doing the Joseph story and then the Moses story, and then came the wilderness, and I prepared a family service, and it really spoke into our situation. And for me, it was a wonderful sign to see that on Christmas Eve in 2020, we had a sermon text on the wilderness wandering. I don't know how many of you heard a sermon on that day. Before I want to go more into how we relate to this text, I want to make a historical detour and go to my second point and want to look at the focus or the development of these stories in Jewish consciousness. So I say the stories shaped Israel's identity as a people, And the stories were also shaped by Israel's journey, identity, and faith experience. I think we can all understand the first part of this, this statement. That's how we understand it. Things happened to Israel, they related them, and this shaped who they were. But the process is a lot more complex than that, because the stories themselves in the retelling were shaped by what was happening to Israel. And they combined them and retold them and shaped different stories together to make one unified story. If we think there's something wrong with that, let's be reminded that we all do exactly the same thing. Every time we sing "We Three Kings," even though the gospel says nothing about kings, but about magi or wise men, we are combining traditions from different places, from the kings. The tradition about the kings from the east coming to share gifts is an Old Testament tradition that we are taking into our Christian story. Or if we place the shepherds and the wise men next to each other in our nativity scenes, we are also making one unified story from different separate accounts. When we have our nativity scenes with angels and stars overhead. We do the same when we speak about the 7 words of Jesus on the cross. There is no gospel where Jesus speaks 7 words. Each one of them have their own way of telling of the experience of Jesus on the cross. If we combine them, we sometimes obscure the impact of the individual words, but we still do that. We do speak of the 7 words on the cross, because it is human to try and put the different experiences, the different stories into one unified whole. In our own life, we do the same thing. When we retell a story 30 years later, it is probably not exactly the same as we told it the day after this event happened, because often in hindsight, we see the significance or how the things shaped us in a different way from the same day. The Israelites were semi-nomads for centuries, and they had their experiences in the wilderness, not only during the Exodus. And these stories were sometimes woven together from different backgrounds, and they tried to shape them into one coherent story. The coherent story, as Haas told it in broad outline yesterday, was an interpretation of their history that one could say they arrived at only a lot later in their history, when many different experiences had shaped their faith. Often when one studies the book of Exodus, and I remember as a young person having this ambition to read the Bible from cover to cover, and I became unstuck in Exodus because it became confusing, and and there were some contradictions that didn't really make sense to me. And it helped me to realize these are actually different traditions woven together. For now, I just want to give a short example, 2 short examples of this, but I will come back to it when we actually look at the texts of the miracle stories. For example, it puzzled me as a child already how the Israelites, who were runaway slaves and were starving in the desert, where they would have got enough jewelry to make a golden calf, or the rich materials that are described as that were needed to make the tabernacle. Even if they did plunder the Egyptians, as is told in the Exodus story, surely a few months later they would have traded most of that to passing nomads or traders for food. So it is fairly certain that there were stories now knit together a lot later. A story that grew from small beginnings, many separate stories and experiences to become one unified story about who they were as a people and their relationship with God. And for me, that is liberating. It opens up the story to realize this is a human interpretation of a story of people's experiences with God. And it is open for interpreting God's intentions in ever new ways. So the Israelites interpreted this time as God teaching them, leading them, drawing them closer to him, teaching them what it was to be the chosen people. But we can find ourselves in that story. The story hasn't ended, and we become part of it. And what always astounds me when I read this story, when I read how the Israelites saw themselves in the desert, is how humanly honest they are about their failings. They had a deep belief that they were the chosen people, but that didn't make them arrogant or made them feel that they had been in any way worthy to be chosen. The whole wilderness story is a story of doubts and failings and grumblings and rebellion and the acts of God again and again and again. It shaped their understanding that they were chosen not because of their heroism or their faith or their worthiness, but completely undeserved, and that God went after them again and again. And this led to wonder and thanksgiving, and it's close to how we as Lutherans understand our faith, that it comes undeserved, comes as a gift which we respond to, sometimes better, sometimes worse. So Israel had already experienced many ways of the presence of God, the miracles of God. They had experienced delivery from slavery, but then again, they were in a situation of suffering, of deprivation. And they grumble and look back to Egypt as the good old days. And this is something that we can probably identify with. We look back at all the things one has lost, forgetting sometimes the problems in those times too. And then come the miracles. The desert turns out not only as a time of hardship, but as a time of miraculous deliverance by God, of amazing signs of God's presence and providence. I want to stop just briefly here and just ask if there are any questions or comments that you want to make right now. I can't see all of you, so I think you just have to unmute and ask if you want to. Otherwise, I will continue. Anyone? Okay. Then let me go to my next point. Miracles are surprising events that renew faith. They can happen to anyone, even today. I want us to read the first text of one of the miracles of the desert of God's provision. Can someone volunteer to read Exodus 16, manna and quail?
I will read Exodus 16, verse 1. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. On the 6th day they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days."
Maybe someone else?
I'll read.
Otherwise, okay.
So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "In the evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. And in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we that you should grumble against us?" Moses also said, "You will know that it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening, and all the bread you want in the morning, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we? You are not grumbling against us, but against the Lord." Then Moses told Aaron, "Say to the entire Israelite community, 'Come before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling.'" While Aaron was speaking to the whole Israelite community, they looked towards the desert, and there was the glory of the Lord appearing in the cloud.
Thank you. And maybe someone else still?
I'll do. The Lord said to Moses, "I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you'll be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God." I'm repeating.
That's fine.
Where was I supposed to go, Gertrude?
13.
Am I
From verse 13.
That evening, quail came and covered the camp. And in the morning, there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, "What is it?" They did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread the Lord has given to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Everyone that they need. Take an omer of each person you have in your tent."
Just continue for them. Just continue, Catherine. Okay.
It's where am I now? 18. The Israelites
17.
did as they were told. Yes, the Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much, some little. And when they measured it by the omer, the one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. Everyone had gathered just as much as they needed. Then Moses said to them, "No one is to keep any of it until morning." However, some of them paid no attention to Moses. They kept part of it until morning, but it was full of maggots and began to smell. So Moses was angry with them. Each morning, everyone gathered as much as they needed, and when the sun grew hot, it melted away.
All right, thank you very much. I'd like to ask Horst again to put us into the same groups, and you can continue the introductions, and then just share anything that you, any immediate responses to the text, questions you had of the text, something that you might not have noticed before? And the question, does the story in any way resonate with your experience?
Gertrud, how long shall we say this time?
I said 7 minutes, but let's make it 10 because at least our group, we didn't quite finish. Okay, sorry, the technologically challenged one. Yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to feedback. We're not going to have a report back session, but if there's anyone from any group that wants to feedback something that maybe they realized that stuck out for them. Okay. All right, let me continue. In our group, one of the an issue came up which I think demonstrates some of what I was saying about the retelling of these stories and them changing. Hatta commented on the fact that initially it says on the story that everyone had exactly what they needed, and but then just after that it says some people stored and some people hoarded. And how do those two things fit together? So here it's an example again of that in the retelling of these stories, they grew and developed, and almost you could say the contradictory elements come into the story. But it's quite clear that this story became very important for people for their teaching of how to live their day-to-day life. So the basic teaching of the story being that God will provide what you need for every day, and we shouldn't store up riches on earth, you could say, but that God will provide what we need from one day to the next, and that we need to trust him for that. And it also has that one didn't come up in our group, but I just want to point it out. We didn't continue reading, but already in this text and just after what we've read comes the story about the Sabbath, that for the Sabbath you could store up for an extra day and it wouldn't go bad, and that God wanted people to rest. On that day, on the seventh day, no manna was found anywhere. Now, I also remember reading this as a young person and wondering, why does God here talk about the Sabbath? They haven't even received the commandments. This is now chapter 16, and the commandments only come in chapter 20. Again, a bit confusing. I mean, he hasn't even given them the Sabbath commandment. So again, we can see that the later experience, the later praxis, you could say they interpreted backwards into this story. And you could say maybe later on in their wanderings after Sinai, some of these things happened. But here, God hasn't even given them that Sabbath commandment. So it is a story that became a teaching story on how to handle possessions, how to deal with the Sabbath, and of course that God provides. It is told as a miracle story. And the question is, what is miraculous about this story? The Israelites find food in the wilderness and they experience it as God's provision. There have been many attempts to explain what manna was. They have tried to explain it as some scholars have tried to explain it as something that naturally occurs in the desert. And then the miracle would be that they find it at the right time to save lives. The quails are fairly easy to explain. They were migrating birds. They had to rest at several points in their journey, and they were fairly easily caught. But the timing, of course, and the fact that it doesn't often happen that a flock of quails will come at just the right time to save lives is what makes it miraculous. A sudden bounty where before there was nothing. The manna has been explained in various ways, as maybe resin from a tree, or some people say it was a substance excreted by some insects in the desert, which is edible. Okay, let me just, forgot to change. Here are the quails. And this is a picture I found on a Christian website. I have no idea if it really is what it says it is, but it is entitled manna. And there are also different, in different places in the Bible, manna is described in different ways. Some of them, not all of them, fitting with what is out there. It's not miraculous to find something edible in the desert. Bedouins have been surviving there for millennia, but they find it at the right time and in the right quantities to save lives. Sorry, let me go back. So I want to say that miracles are not necessarily something which is impossible to explain, but they are unexpected. They come at a time when faith is shaky and hope is at its end, and they enable new faith and new hope at that time. This is similar with the story of the, just one more thing about the manna. Obviously, manna in the experience of Israel and in the retelling of these stories becomes something very important and symbolic. It becomes a powerful symbol of God's presence and sustenance. And it becomes called, even in the Old Testament already, it is called the bread of heaven. And we know that this is not drawn on by Jesus in the Gospel of John to explain his own significance. It teaches them something about who God is and who they are as people. So this is a story that is repeated and is repeated. And we find it again in the book of Numbers. Their manna is present, but they start grumbling about the manna because all they get is manna, manna, manna. They want something else. So here again, you could say they are not hungry. God is providing, but they are always showing, the Israelites were quite self-critical, showing that it was almost as if they never had enough. They wanted more. The Israelites told these stories in a self-critical way, showing their own rebellion and God's patience with them. You could say, and there are some places where in the story you can say God almost gives up and says, okay, now I've had it. I've tried, I've given these people so much and they still don't want to trust me. And where Moses then intercedes for the people and says, please, you will make yourself sound ridiculous, as Horst said yesterday. Be true to yourself and forgive these people. I want to move on to the other story, the water from the rock, and ask someone else to please read this passage. Anyone volunteer?
I'll read it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Water from the rock. At the Lord's command, the whole community of Israel left the wilderness of Sin and moved from place to place. Eventually, they camped at Rephidim, but there was no water there for the people to drink. So once more, the people complained against Moses. Give us water to drink, they demanded. Quiet, Moses replied. Why are you complaining against me? And why are you testing the Lord? But tormented by thirst, they continued to argue with Moses. Why did you bring us out of Egypt? Are you trying to kill us, our children, and our livestock with thirst? Then Moses cried out to the Lord, what should I do with these people? They are ready to stone me. The Lord said to Moses, walk out in front of the people, take your staff, the one you used when you struck the water of the Nile, and call some of the elders of Israel to join you. I will stand before you on the rock of Mount Sinai, strike the rock, and water will come gushing out. Then the people will be able to drink. So Moses struck the rock as he was told, and water gushed out as the elders looked on. Moses named the place Massah, which means test, and Meribah, which means argue, because the people of Israel argued with Moses and tested the Lord by saying, is the Lord here with us or not?
Thank you very much. I'd again like us to go into groups, this time just 5 minutes. Again, just sharing any reactions to this text and where we find it resonates with our experience. Right.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. I hope you had a good discussion, even though it was brief. In this story, one could say there's almost less of an emphasis on the miracle that thirsty people who are really at the end of their physical abilities to survive receive water, but there's a lot of emphasis on the grumbling and on the rebellion. The two names that happen at the end, Massah and Meribah, become almost synonymous in the Hebrew writings of rebellion against God. Here again, it could be two traditions coming together. It looks here as if it's the same place, but the two names are often also used in different places. So, yeah. But Meribah becomes synonymous with rebellion against God. So here there's a big focus on the grumbling. But it is also a miraculous sign of sustenance, of water is really the one thing that one cannot do without. The question was raised in our group, why did Moses have to strike a rock? And what is the miracle in here? I know some of you who German might know the German theologian Gertrud Tönsing, who wrote many books with pictures and who traveled extensively in Palestine. And he wrote about an experience where in the Arabian desert, people showed him how you can get water from a rock. There are places in the desert where there are cracks in the rock, where there are springs. But because these rocks are not sheltered in any way, they blow full of sand. And this wet sand becomes like clay that covers, that dries up or blocks off the spring. So it's like a tap you have shut. No water comes out. Any wetness dries up and no plants can grow there. So unless you have a very good eye or know the desert very well, you will walk past that water and you will not find it. Only someone who really knows what they are looking for, or with a very sharp eye, can find that water. But if you hit that clay with your staff, it breaks open and that water can flow again. But as soon as the next sandstorm comes, that will be blocked again. It will vanish and any sign of it will not be visible anymore. So the question is again, what is the miracle? It's not that there is water in the desert. There are oases, there are these springs, there are these places where one can find water, and the Bedouins have survived on it for centuries. But the Israelites find it at the time they need it to sustain their life and to sustain their hope and their faith. So they entrust their life to God, and God does lead them to these places where they find what they need so they can survive from one day to the next. So as I said, these stories were told and retold again and changed in that experience. And particularly during the time of exile, I think these stories again became very, very central to Israelite identity and the way they understood themselves, much as they have done for me and for others in the time of Corona. You suddenly relate to these stories in a way you haven't related before. My own suspicion, I'm fairly convinced that, for example, the detail that these wanderings lasted for 40 years might have come from the experience of exile, where the people found themselves and identified with these stories again. And they kept reminding themselves of their grumblings and rebellion critically, that they should trust God again and again, because I'm pretty sure that in exile there was a lot of grumbling again. And sorry, I've lost my place. And you could say in exile, the miracle happens again. Israel finds a new faith, a new way of understanding themselves, and a new way of going forward, which you could say without that experience, without that fact that they were able to regroup in exile when they had lost their temple, they had lost their land, and be reminded that before they had the temple, before they had the land, they had their God, and that God is still with them. And I think that wilderness time, and also the prophets sort of pointed in that direction, was a time when they became a people, and they can become a people again, or can remain a people and be sustained through this time. In many ways, it really is a miracle that Israel kept its faith in exile, when there were these gods around them that would just seem so much stronger. This tiny nation that was buffeted around and never really had much time to be powerful, their faith survived. And the big nations, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Greece and Rome, all these gods have been forgotten long ago. And that really is an astounding story. And I think the wilderness experience was probably crucial in shaping this new way of going forward for Israel. Psalm 106 was written in a time such as this, probably shortly after the exile, when many were still scattered. It reminds the people, and many other psalms take up the wilderness experience. The remembrance of the past becomes a challenge and a source of hope. And I want to read some of the verses. Oh, there I have didn't even show you the water from the rock. Sorry about that. Yeah, can someone read the verses from Psalm 106? I'm running out of time.
Many times he delivered them, but they were bent on rebellion. Sorry, this thing is covering. Yeah. And they wasted away in their sin, but he took note of their distress when he heard their cry. For their sake, he remembered his covenant, and out of his great love, he relented. Save us, O Lord our God, and gather us from the nations, that we may give thanks to your holy name and glory in your praise.
Thank you. So here they're looking back to the past to enable them, this must have written shortly after the exile, to enable them to go into the future, and would say reminding God of his loyalty to them and his carrying them and taking them. I'm sure you all have stories of doubts and fears and moments of despair in the last months, and we've shared many of those. And I think many of us have had experiences where something happened that was unexpected or that lifted us up at that moment. I want to share one which an acquaintance of mine who is in the same running club as I am shared with me. She had an unbelievably difficult time the last year. She runs her own business doing engravings on silver and glass. So most of her clients come from schools and sports events. So trophies is what she does. And that business obviously suffered this year. And she said to me, I try to stay positive, and you know, I have seen miracles. She told me a story how she contracted someone to do a skilled job which she could not handle on her own. And he was also having a difficult time, but he said he didn't want payments. It's payback time. And she still had tears in her eyes when she said that. Someone had sacrificed money, which he also needed, because he knew she was struggling. And that act of generosity really motivated her to keep going, to try and save the jobs of her employees. She saw it as a miracle. There were many little miracles that kept me going, maybe that kept you going in this time. And I'm sorry we won't have much time to share that anymore. But I just want to say one more thing about miracles that science perhaps cannot explain. Do they happen? It's important to know the limitations of the scientific method. Science can study those things that are regular, are repeatable. To stand the test of science, you must be able to isolate variables and test those things repeatedly. But most of life is not like that. A man falls in love with woman A and not woman B. Or two siblings raised by the same parents turn out so differently that one becomes a professor and the other a drug addict. How do we isolate for those variables? Life is so complex. And I want to share an experience which we had not that long ago, quite a few years ago, in the Plettenberg Bay area. And we were sitting, Detlef and myself were sitting on the rocks right at the bottom here, sort of overlooking the hotel. And it's quite high up. The waves were nowhere near us, not even the spray was touching us, and we were having a sundowner. And we were sitting with our back to the hotel, looking sort of direction of the sunset. And yeah, there was no problem. The spray wasn't even touching us. And suddenly from behind, this enormous wave came and drenched us from the top. It got us in such a way that nothing was washed away. It was all still there, even our drenched chips. And it swept right up on the beach into the dunes. And there were a couple of also surprised walkers. It wasn't very crowded. But it was a freak wave, which happened because different things reinforce each other. And it was nothing that we could have explained, but it was also nothing that was not explainable in a way, because we know that these strange coincidences happen. I remember having nightmares about what would have happened if that very same wave had struck us from the side. It would have struck us, it would have probably washed us onto the rocks, and we could have been injured quite badly, but it broke in such a way that we were just sitting there drenched. Freak waves happen, seemingly unnatural occurrences happen that we cannot explain in hindsight. But sometimes they're tragic, and sometimes they are life-saving. We can learn to see the things that are unexpected, that build us up, that turn things in a new direction as the miracles of God or as the sustenance of God. And we can also learn to be courageous with each other and say, I have experienced miracles, just like this woman said to me. I would have liked us to still have a time to share, but I think you can still do that at home. We have run out of time. I want us to end the session by singing that song one more time, The People of God, which we sang yesterday. We missed out the final verse. Just think about how our own life is entwined in this story. If I can ask Horst to just find it for us.
Gertrud, I have to find it again. You have to first of all stop.
Sorry, I didn't give you a warning this time. Okay. While Horst is finding it, is there any comment that anyone still wants to make? Or question?
Gertrude, just to say that I think it's a wonderful new way of looking at miracles. And I think by looking at miracles in this way, we will be able to identify a lot more in our lives, just by looking at the timing of things. Thank you.
Okay, I think I can share it now. So I'm going to switch over to the video.
temptation.